All right, I want to take one final look at a few countries in the EU that will be having elections on June 9th this year. Look at some of the polls and see what we can expect, which of these elections are kind of going to be important to look at in the upcoming weeks. And this is going to be kind of a general overview of these countries that I haven't covered yet, that I've gotten some suggestions to cover. But before I go into that, I want to say thank you to everyone that has subscribed. We have reached 1,000 subscribers over the past few days, and this has been, a huge growth in the channel over the past several weeks since the last few videos. So I thank everyone that has joined, everyone that is subscribed. Thank you all for watching these videos and commenting, and I'm very happy that this channel has grown as much as it has, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the videos in the future. So thank you all. And so this video we're going to cover Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Finland, and Belgium. And we're going to start off with Belgium. Now, Belgium is a very interesting country within the EU because it effectively operates as two separate regions. There's the Dutch-speaking north, known as Flanders, and the French-speaking south, known as Wallonia. And although they're both part of Belgium, part of the same country, they don't really consider themselves to be together. They operate on very different levels, and they speak different languages, and there is kind of a divide between the two different regions, not only economically, but politically. And we see that especially when we look at elections with the different political parties. There are some that operate in both the north and the south, but we can see even the Greens, which don't transcend kind of a nationalistic or regional lines. It is, based on ecology and an issue that should be able to transcend this divide, despite that there is a Greens that operate in the French-speaking part and a Greens that operate in the Dutch-speaking part. Now, of course, these parties with ideological similarities are able to work together on the federal level, but they don't always operate under the same leadership in Brussels, in the nation's capital. So there is kind of a difference in a very divided political scene, a very divided political field in the country. Belgium is one country where a lot of times there is a trouble forming a government, a coalition. It's hard for there to be a majority of, parties in the country that are able to come together and form a stable majority to elect a prime minister. So a lot of times there is problems with forming government. It's a very unstable country in terms of its politics. But if we take a look at the polls for the Dutch-speaking part of Flanders, there is two kind of right-wing nationalist parties that represent the Dutch Flemish minority, or Flemish majority rather, but they want Flanders to be either autonomous or completely independent. And so we have the New Flemish Alliance that is part of the ECR. They won the elections last time in Flanders. And then there's the more right-wing nationalist Vlaams Belang, the Flemish Interest, which is a part of the ID group. So they're very similar on some of the issues, but of course Vlaams Belang is more to the right. They're part of the ID group, whereas the New Flemish Alliance is part of the ECR. The New Flemish Alliance has been part of governments in the past where Vlaams Belang has kind of been considered too extreme. And if we see here, the results is kind of a reverse of what happened in the last elections in 2019, where New Flemish Alliance is dropping some and Vlaams Belang is gaining some, but the overall seat change is not much different. Now, this could determine which of the two will lead the nationalist kind of pro-independence camp in the future, but what's important to note is Belgium will hold its national and regional elections on the same day. Now, here is Open Vid. This is a very important party. This is the party of Guy Verhofstadt, which was the former leader of the entire liberal grouping in the European Parliament. They are at around 12%, a slight drop, but this is an important party. It has, its history with Guy Verhofstadt in the entire liberal grouping, a very, a veteran of this parliamentary group. And we can see there's various, left-wing and liberal parties also here, but the main two are the, the right-wing nationalist parties and the liberals. And what's very interesting to note is when you look at the two regions, there's a clear divide, because you look at the northern part, the Dutch-speaking part, Flanders, there is a right-wing, two very right-wing parties in first and second, then a liberal centrist party. And if you look at the south, it's the complete opposite. You have two left-wing parties and then a liberal party. And a lot of the problems with the south is the French-speaking part is very underdeveloped. There's a lot of economic problems, and so they do have a kind of left-wing populist, political movement there. For example, there's the Socialist Workers' Party that operates in both parts of the country. They are stronger in the French-speaking part in the south, and they are expected to actually gain a seat in the north in the Dutch-speaking part and kind of gain a seat in the French-speaking part as well. But we can see the results for the Socialist Party, the kind of social democratic center-left force in the south is basically holding its own. The Greens are probably going to lose a seat, and that'll probably end up going to the Socialists. You have also a Liberal Party here, and that will basically hold, maybe gain some votes, but the overall seat change won't really mean too much. And the elections in Belgium won't be too significant because, like I said, the national elections and the regional elections will be held in Belgium at the same time. So any meaningful, notes that can be taken from these results won't mean anything, because we'll have the actual national election results on the same day. Sometimes the EU elections will kind of be seen as a referendum, as a test, as like a poll for what's going to happen in future national elections. But since those elections are already being held, that won't be the case here. And overall, the results, not too much of a change, not too much of a difference, but the national elections will be more important. But this is, kind of the quick overview of Belgium. And the next country I want to go to is the Czech Republic. Now, in the Czech Republic, we have a somewhat interesting development. The ANO party, led by the former Prime Minister Babis, is currently in the lead. They're ahead by 7 points in the polls, ahead of the Spolu group. Now, what's important to note is that these two parties do not necessarily fit along with the rest of their EU-wide party members, and that is because the ANO, despite being part of Renew, which is one of the most pro-EU parliamentary groupings, the party itself is somewhat populist, especially under Babis. They were somewhat more populist and anti-establishment than the rest of the parties are in that grouping. And the Spolu group, of course, they are some of the members rather are part of the ECR, which is a more national conservative parliamentary grouping in the EU. Despite that, they are more Europhilic and more kind of sympathetic towards the EU. They formed a coalition with the Pirate Party, which is a part of the Greens. And so it's not to say that the Spolu group is, liberal, or the ANO group is completely populist and Eurosceptic, but there are some aspects in which the politicians or the parties themselves are different, at least on some level, than the rest of their allies, in the European-wide parties themselves. Now, we can see, of course, the ANO is ahead in the polls, and they're getting slightly ahead of what they got in the last parliamentary election, and, of course, a lot ahead of what they got in the last EU elections, around 21%. The Spolu group is around what they got at the last EU elections, down from the parliamentary elections. Now, the Pirate Party, which is a part of the Greens, is around 10%. They have basically replaced the left in the Czech Republic, because the old Communist Party and Social Democratic Party, which were kind of dominant forces in Czech politics, even going back to the end of World War II, have completely collapsed. In the last parliamentary elections, both the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party fell below the threshold to win seats in the parliamentary election. They have no seats currently in the current parliament. So the only force on the left, whether it be the far left or center left, is the Pirate Party, and they're pulling around 10%, kind of replacing that. You do have the Stand Party, kind of alliance of liberal and conservative, independents, and they're around 10% as well. And then you have the SPD, which is not to be confused with the German SPD. It is a right-wing populist, nationalist Eurosceptic group. It's part of the ID party in Europe, and so they are at around 10%. This is about what they got in the last election, but nonetheless, this is kind of a check on the current incumbent government. There was a race between the ANO and the Spolu in the last general election, so this can kind of be a referendum on the current incumbent government, and also kind of a competition for the different various parties at around 10% to get some seats. But nonetheless, there's not too many other developments, and now we are going to go on to the next country, which is Slovakia. Now, of course, the important thing to note with Slovakia is there was recently an assassination attempt on the current Prime Minister, Robert Fico, of the Smer party, and he has survived, but he is, of course, recovering from that, and it's not yet known how long it will be until he resumes the office or active duties of being the Prime Minister of the country. Now, I expect this to have an effect on the election. Usually, if there's an attack on a political leader, there's a lot of sympathy for that individual. Even if he is a controversial figure, I expect there to be some maybe effect, and we don't really see that in the polls now. It might not happen, but there could. It's safe to assume that there might be some fluctuation in the polls after this, this attempt on his life, and we could see maybe some developments, some change in the parties. But overall, what I want to take a look at is the three parties involved in his coalition, and that is the Smer party and the Hlas party. These were both part of the S&D group because they are social democratic parties, but of course, like many countries in Eastern Europe, they are somewhat more nationalistic and populist than the social democrats in other countries. They're more socially conservative than a lot of the social democratic parties in the West, and for some of the reasons, including the fact that they formed a coalition with the right-wing populist SNS party, these two parties, the Smer and Hlas, were suspended from the S&D group. So they are social democratic parties, but they do not sit with the S&D European-wide social democrats anymore. They have lost their membership. And they are still center-left parties that represent, kind of the broad social democratic positions within Slovakia, but they do hold positions that in Western European countries would be seen as somewhat right-wing populist, and they do form this kind of Eurosceptic, populist political core in the country, and they are currently the majority in the parliament. They had national elections last year, or earlier this year, and well, there was last year rather, and they won a victory. And it was somewhat of a surprise because the party, the PS party, which is the kind of new liberal party that actually won the EU elections back in 2019, off of that result was expected to be able to win the general elections, maybe form kind of a pro-EU liberal government. That did not happen, and Robert Fico, who was prime minister before, was re-elected. And there was also presidential elections in which Pellegrini, his ally and part of the Halas party, was able to win the presidential election. And so this kind of coalition has, somewhat of a complete control over the country. Now, this election will be a test on the Fico government, and we can see that the Liberal Party, the PS, is polling ahead of both what they got at the general elections and at the last European parliamentary elections. They are currently ahead in the polls. The Smer party of Fico is down, slightly ahead of what they got in the last EU elections, but down from the general elections. The main important thing to note is whether or not the PS and other liberal parties aligned to them get more votes combined than Smer, Halas, and the SNS. That will kind of be a referendum on the current government, and if Fico's parties are able to win, that is a good sign for him. Of course, if they're not able to reach a majority, that's a bad sign. Of course, doesn't mean that they're going to lose the next general election, but kind of a warning signal. And you do have various parties, part of the EPP, ECR grouping, all at around 0 to 5%. A lot of parties actually, and some of them aren't going to get seats. But you all have one last party to talk about, and that is the Republicana party, which is a very, very right-wing nationalist party. They split away from the far-right LSNS group, and so they're at around 10%. They're expected to win some seats, 7%, and some others. Nonetheless, that'll get them a seat. And they are a party that kind of sits to the right of the SNS, and they will likely win seats. But the main thing to note, like I said, is whether or not the liberal, pro-EU, or the more Eurosceptic center-left grouping will win more votes in this election. And so that'll be it for Slovakia, and now we're going to go to the last country, which is Finland. Now, Finland is similar to the other Nordic countries. You have kind of a center-right liberal conservative and a more national conservative party kind of competing neck and neck. You have a very strong social democratic tradition. Most countries in the north, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, have very strong social democratic parties that have been in power and government in the past. And you also have these kind of agrarian center parties that are kind of represent the farmers. They're somewhat center-left, but also maybe in socially conservative in the past, that represent the rural areas and work with the social democrats at times. And you also have, some other parties. And if we can take a look at the polls here, we see that the center-right national coalition is basically at the same, level they got the last European and national elections. Not too much to say there. They are, going to be satisfied. This is a moderate result for them. The Green Party is slightly down from what they got the last European parliamentary elections, around 10%. Not too much of a change. This is not too much of a significant result. The Social Democrats suffered kind of a loss. They've dropped down to 14% in the last EU elections, and it's showing that they're kind of recovering from that, getting around what they got at the last parliamentary elections. Now, the True Finns party, the PS, is a nationalist Finnish party. It's a right-wing populist party. They were formerly a part of the ID group, but they joined the ECR. A lot of it had to do with foreign policy. The ID group is very friendly towards Russia. The ECR is a lot more hostile, and Finland being on the border, that is a very important issue for them. Foreign policy issues are very important, so the PS, especially after the war between Russia and Ukraine, made the decision to leave and join the ECR. They are currently polling below what they got in the last general election, but that makes sense because in the EU elections, they usually tend to do slightly worse. At least they have in somewhat in the past. And they are polling around 14%. This is a slight improvement. This is around what they got at the last European parliamentary elections, but it's not what they got at the last parliamentary election. So I think this will be kind of seen as a defeat for them. Not a huge defeat, but it will be kind of a loss. The Agrarian Center Party is at around the same what they got. And we see the left, which is a kind of a left-wing populist party, further to the left, is expected to maybe gain a seat around 10% of the vote. And this is probably going to be taking away from what the Greens got. So we see overall a shift of maybe one seat from the Greens to the left. We see that the mainstream parties, the Social Democrats and the National Coalition, are doing moderately, well what they got in the last general election, and we see that the right-wing True Finns party is losing some support, but overall not too many significant developments. But that is going to be it for Finland, and that's going to be it for this video, and I thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.